You may notice something strange the moment you hear the phrase, "You are already free." Part of you recognizes something true in it before the mind even has time to argue. Then almost immediately another part rises and says that cannot possibly be true, because your life still contains pressure, limits, and situations you did not choose. The contradiction begins there, not because one side is wise and the other is foolish, but because both are describing something real from different layers of experience. If you do not separate those layers, the statement will always sound either naive or unreachable. Most people hear freedom as a circumstantial word. They think freedom means the removal of pressure, the resolution of conflict, the opening of options, the end of inner struggle. In ordinary life, that makes sense, because circumstance does shape experience in very real ways. A person with fewer choices feels less free than a person with more choices. And a person carrying heavy pain will not experience the day the same way as someone standing in ease. But the phrase points to something deeper than conditions, and that is where many listeners either lose interest or become quietly defensive. The defensive reaction is understandable, because if freedom exists at a level deeper than conditions, then you can no longer postpone it until life becomes more favorable. The mind prefers freedom as a future reward because that keeps the idea organized. It allows the person to say, "When this changes, then I will be free. When I heal this pattern, then I will be free. When I leave this environment, then I will be free." But if freedom already exists in some form beneath all of that, then the delay may not be coming from life itself. It may be coming from the way life is being interpreted. This is where the mechanism becomes important. The feeling of being trapped is rarely caused by circumstance alone. It is usually built through a sequence that happens so fast it feels invisible. Something difficult appears, then the mind names it, then it explains it, then it extends it into the future. Then it turns it into a statement about identity. A moment becomes a meaning, and then that meaning becomes a structure. By the time this process is complete, the person is no longer just feeling pressure. They are living inside a story about what that pressure means. You can see this in very ordinary moments. A conflict happens in a relationship, and within minutes the mind begins building conclusions about whether love is stable, whether you are safe, whether this pattern defines the future. A setback happens in work, and the mind quickly turns one event into evidence that you are stuck, that movement is blocked, that nothing substantial will change. The circumstance matters, but the interpretation multiplies its weight. What you call being trapped is often your nervous system responding not only to life, but to the story that has been wrapped around life. That does not mean the story is imaginary in the shallow sense. Stories are powerful because they are often built around real pain, real disappointment, real limitation, real consequences. The problem is not that the mind invents everything from nothing. The problem is that it takes one layer of truth and quietly presents it as the whole truth. It says this pressure is here, therefore freedom is not. It says this emotion is intense, therefore openness is absent. It says this chapter is difficult, therefore your life itself has become a cage. Once that pattern is seen, something starts to shift in perspective. You begin to realize that the feeling of being trapped is not always a direct measurement of reality. It is often a measurement of how tightly identity has fused with circumstance. When a situation is happening, and you are also turning that situation into a definition of who you are, the experience becomes much heavier. The pressure is no longer passing through your life. It is now sitting at the center of your self-concept, and once that happens, even temporary conditions can feel permanent. This is why people can have moments of genuine openness in the middle of difficult lives, and they can also feel deeply trapped in situations that outwardly look manageable. The outer circumstance matters, but it does not explain everything. What matters just as much is whether the person's awareness has any room left inside the experience. If every thought is believed immediately, if every emotion is treated as a final truth, if every condition is allowed to become identity, then the inner field tightens. The person does not just encounter difficulty, they become enclosed inside it. So when the teaching says you are already free, it is not claiming that your circumstances are irrelevant. It is pointing to the fact that awareness itself is not made out of the conditions moving through it. Thoughts move inside awareness, but awareness is not made of thought. Emotions move inside awareness, but awareness is not made of emotion. Conditions appear inside awareness, but awareness is not made of circumstance. This matters because it introduces a different basis for freedom. Freedom is no longer something granted only when life becomes easy. It becomes visible as the openness within which all experience is already unfolding. The mind usually resists this for a simple reason. It assumes that if freedom is real, then the feeling of being trapped should disappear immediately. It wants a practical proof that arrives as relief. But awareness does not operate by the same rules as psychological comfort. You can recognize openness and still feel sorrow. You can sense an underlying freedom and still have responsibilities that limit what you can do. You can notice that awareness is open, while your human experience remains pressured, unfinished, and very much in motion. This is where the contradiction becomes mature enough to teach you something. Freedom and limitation are not opposites in the way the mind assumes. They are descriptions from different levels of experience. Limitation belongs to action, body, circumstance, history, environment, and time. Freedom belongs to the fact that none of those things can become the entirety of what you are. If you confuse those levels, you will either deny your humanity in the name of spirituality or deny your deeper nature in the name of realism. The more honest view holds both without rushing to collapse one into the other. You may notice this in your own experience if you become very quiet around a difficult moment. There is the situation itself. There is the emotion that rises in response to it. There is the thought stream trying to explain what is happening, and then there is something else that is simply aware of all of it. That awareness is not an escape from the moment. It is what allows the moment to be experienced at all. If you do not notice it, the content takes over completely. If you do notice it, the moment does not necessarily get easier right away, but it becomes less total. That less total feeling is often the first living taste of this contradiction. The problem may still be present, yet you begin to sense that the problem is not the whole field. The emotion may still be intense, yet it no longer has the same authority to define reality by itself. A difficult chapter may still need action, change, courage, or endurance, but it stops functioning as final proof that freedom is absent. Something in you remains uncollapsed. Something in you can witness without becoming identical to what it witnesses. That is not a trick of language. It is a structural change in experience. Once that becomes even slightly familiar, the implications widen. You begin to see why so many people wait for freedom while repeatedly overlooking it. They are searching for a state in which pressure no longer exists, and because life rarely offers that for long, freedom keeps being postponed. But if freedom is first recognized as the openness that exists even while life is in motion, then the relationship to pressure changes. Pressure stops being automatic evidence of imprisonment. It becomes one movement among many inside a field that is larger than any single movement. This does not make action unnecessary. In fact, it often makes action clearer. When you are no longer interpreting every difficulty as a statement about your entire identity, you can respond with more precision. A boundary can be set without becoming a declaration of war. A change can be made without needing to dramatize the whole chapter. A painful truth can be admitted without turning it into a philosophy of hopelessness. Freedom at the level of awareness does not replace practical movement. It allows practical movement to happen without so much distortion. That is why this teaching matters in ordinary life and not only in contemplation. It changes how you carry conversations, choices, disappointments, delays, ambitions, endings, and uncertainty. It changes whether the mind immediately turns every obstacle into a wall, or whether it can remain open long enough to discover what is actually possible. It changes whether pain is treated as information moving through experience or as proof that your life has narrowed into one final meaning. The same circumstance can feel radically different depending on whether awareness is forgotten or remembered. You may also begin to understand why some forms of self-help quietly fail people even when they offer useful tools. They try to improve the content of experience without addressing the field in which that content is being interpreted. They teach better thinking, better habits, better routines, better outcomes, all of which may help. But if the person still believes that every difficult condition has the power to define the whole self, then even improved circumstances will only produce temporary relief. The old structure will return as soon as life becomes uncertain again. The deeper invitation is not simply to think more positively or to detach from what is happening. It is to notice the difference between experiencing limitation and becoming psychologically enclosed by it. That difference is subtle at first, but once seen, it keeps unfolding. You start catching the moment when the mind begins extending one event into a total narrative. You start seeing how quickly identity tries to crystallize around passing difficulty. And you start sensing that openness was not something you had to create after all. It was present before the story tightened, present while the story formed, and present now as the story begins to loosen. And once that loosening begins, another question naturally appears. If openness has always been present, why does the feeling of confinement become so convincing in the first place? The answer is not that people are weak, unconscious, or simply thinking the wrong thoughts. The answer is that the human system is built to protect continuity, and one of the ways it protects continuity is by turning repeated patterns into unquestioned realities. What begins as adaptation can harden into identity, and once that happens, even a passing condition can feel like a permanent home. You can see this mechanism most clearly in places where the same emotional pattern has repeated for years. Someone has felt dismissed often enough that one difficult conversation now seems to confirm a lifelong truth. Someone has experienced instability often enough that any uncertainty immediately feels dangerous. Someone has known pressure for so long that calm itself becomes unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is interpreted as unsafe rather than spacious. The system stops asking what is happening now and starts reacting to what has happened many times before. In that moment, life is no longer being met directly. It is being filtered through the structure of memory. That filter changes perspective more than most people realize. A present moment may contain one difficult event, but the mind feels the weight of 10 years while responding to it. The body may be reacting to one conversation, one delay, one silence, one setback. But the nervous system is not responding as if this is one moment. It is responding as if the entire archive has opened at once. This is why some situations feel bigger than they appear from the outside. The experience is not being created by the present alone. It is being amplified by everything the present resembles. Once you understand that, the contradiction becomes even more practical. Feeling trapped does not always mean life is objectively closed. Sometimes it means old pattern recognition has taken over faster than conscious awareness could enter the room. The mind sees similarity and assumes sameness. The body feels activation and assumes danger. Identity feels the familiar pressure and immediately begins organizing itself around survival. In that sequence, freedom is not absent. It is simply being outpaced by the speed of conditioning. That matters because it changes what the work actually is. The work is not to force yourself into a feeling of freedom while the system is unconvinced. If that moment can be seen even faintly, the experience begins changing. The event may still be difficult, but it is no longer carrying the same invisible authority. You are no longer only inside the reaction. You are also beginning to see the machinery that produces the reaction, and that is a different kind of freedom than most people imagine. It is not the freedom of having no patterns. It is the freedom of not being completely ruled by a pattern the moment it activates. It is not the freedom of a perfect nervous system. It is the freedom of recognizing that a nervous system can fire without becoming the final author of reality. It is not dramatic from the outside, but inwardly, it changes everything. The person begins moving from total identification toward participation. You may notice something subtle here. Participation feels very different from control. Participation stays in contact long enough to understand what shape experience is already taking. Control is tense because it treats uncertainty as failure. Participation is steadier because it allows uncertainty to exist while still remaining engaged. When people begin sensing freedom beneath circumstance, what often changes first is not the outer situation, but the quality of contact they bring into it. That shift can be noticed in conversation, conflict, and choice. A person who feels fully trapped tends to move from reaction into conclusion with almost no space in between. They assume, defend, predict, withdraw, or overreach because the system is trying to close uncertainty as fast as possible. But when even a little openness is present, the sequence slows down. There is enough room to notice the interpretation while it is happening. There is enough room to ask whether the meaning being assigned is actually true. There is enough room to discover that the moment may be difficult without having to become absolute. This is why awareness cannot be reduced to a vague spiritual comfort. It changes the mechanics of experience. It changes how quickly you fuse with the story. It changes how much authority a thought is given the moment it appears. It changes whether the body is allowed to have an activation without the mind instantly translating that activation into identity. It does not remove life from motion. It changes how much of that motion becomes law. The implications of that are wider than they first appear. If identity is no longer built so quickly around passing conditions, then life begins to feel less like a courtroom and more like a field of learning. A hard chapter is no longer immediate proof that you are failing. A delay is no longer proof that you are cursed or permanently blocked. A difficult feeling is no longer proof that you have fallen out of alignment with what is deepest in you. The same events still matter, but they stop carrying the weight of final judgment. This also changes how growth is understood. Many people imagine growth as reaching a point where they no longer feel trapped by anything. But that goal usually creates frustration because life keeps presenting new forms of pressure. The more grounded understanding is that growth involves becoming less available to total enclosure. Pressure may still arise. Fear may still visit. Limitation may still be real. But the entire inner world no longer closes around those experiences in the same way. You do not become unreachable by difficulty. You become less collapsible inside it. That distinction deserves to return because it reveals why freedom can coexist with human vulnerability. If freedom meant invulnerability, then every emotional wave would disprove it. If freedom meant perfect choice, then every limitation would cancel it. If freedom meant constant ease, then ordinary life would make it impossible. But if freedom means that no single condition can fully become the measure of what you are, then vulnerability no longer contradicts it. Vulnerability becomes one more movement within an awareness that is larger than the movement itself. You may start seeing this everywhere once the structure becomes visible. A person speaks as if one rejection defines their worth. Another lives as if one role defines their identity. Someone else quietly believes that one unfinished chapter defines the rest of their future. In every case, the issue is not merely pain. It is enclosure. The mind takes something real and wraps the whole self around it. And once that wrapping happens, freedom feels theoretical, because the lived experience has narrowed to one interpretation. This is where another layer of perspective matters. The mind often believes that strong interpretation is necessary for safety. It assumes that if it loosens the story, it will become passive, careless, or unprepared. But that is not what actually happens. When interpretation loosens, perception improves. You become more able to see what a situation really asks for, because you are less busy defending an identity inside it. Clarity becomes possible not because the stakes disappeared, but because the self has stopped making the stakes larger than the moment requires. That is why this teaching does not encourage distance from life. It encourages greater intimacy with life by reducing distortion. When the story softens, you can finally meet the actual shape of what is here. You can notice what belongs to the current moment and what belongs to accumulated memory. You can feel the body's reaction without instantly building a philosophy out of it. You can care deeply without assuming that care requires collapse. This is not withdrawal from the human layer. It is a more honest way of inhabiting it. And the more honestly you inhabit it, the more the original phrase begins changing in meaning. "You are already free" no longer sounds like an abstract promise or a spiritual slogan. It begins sounding like a reminder that awareness is not waiting at the end of your healing, your success, your clarity, or your perfect regulation. It is what has been here through all of those movements. It is what remained present while identity tightened, while the nervous system defended, while the mind built conclusions, and while life kept changing shape. The conditions may still be moving, but you begin to sense that openness was never the future reward. It was the quiet fact underneath every moment in which you thought you had lost it. The reason that matters is because many people spend years trying to improve the content of their lives without ever examining the process that turns content into confinement. They change cities, jobs, relationships, habits, beliefs, and routines, and some of those changes are necessary and good. But if the mind still moves in the same sequence, the old feeling returns in a new setting. A new chapter begins, but the same enclosure forms around it because the deeper pattern was not the circumstance alone. The pattern was the speed with which experience became identity, and identity became a prison. This is why the teaching cannot remain abstract. If it stays abstract, the listener may agree with it while still living inside the same tightening every day. What changes things is not merely the idea that awareness is open. What changes things is learning to notice the exact moment when openness begins collapsing into interpretation. It is the moment after the difficult text, after the unexpected silence, after the mistake, after the delay, after the feeling in the body, when the mind begins moving from contact into conclusion. If that movement can be seen even once, the structure is no longer completely invisible. And once the structure is no longer invisible, a new form of responsibility appears. Not the heavy responsibility of fixing yourself all at once, but the quieter responsibility of not handing absolute authority to every interpretation that arises. This is a mature kind of inner work because it does not demand perfection. It asks for honesty and attention. It asks whether what you are feeling is real, and then whether the meaning you are assigning to that feeling is equally real. That second question alone begins reopening space. You may notice how different life feels when that space is present. The mind still comments, but its commentary no longer arrives as law. The body still reacts, but the reaction no longer has to define the whole moment. Circumstances still matter, but they stop carrying the power to become the entirety of your self-understanding. This does not make life passive or detached. It makes life more workable because the person is no longer using the total weight of identity to solve every passing condition. That is one of the deeper implications of this contradiction. If you are already free at the level of awareness, then your task is not to manufacture freedom from nothing. Your task is to become more skillful at noticing where freedom is being forgotten. This is a very different orientation than waiting for life to finally grant you permission to breathe. It means openness is not something postponed to the end of the struggle. It is something that can be remembered even within the struggle, and that remembrance changes the quality of every response that follows. Most people assume that if they stop dramatizing a difficult situation, they will stop caring about it. They assume intensity is proof of sincerity, and that without enclosure, there will be passivity or denial. But the spiral view reveals the opposite. When interpretation loosens, care becomes more accurate. You stop wasting energy defending a total identity and begin meeting the actual shape of the moment. This is why the difference matters. It changes not only how you feel inwardly, but also how well you can respond outwardly. You can see this in the way people act when they are fully fused with a difficult story. Their attention narrows, their listening weakens. Their choices become exaggerated because the mind believes the whole self is under threat. But when some openness is present, the situation is still taken seriously without being inflated into total meaning. The person becomes more precise, not less invested. The response becomes cleaner because the inner world is not as crowded with conclusions about what the moment supposedly proves. That is also why freedom should not be confused with positive thinking. Positive thinking often tries to replace one interpretation with a more pleasant interpretation. Sometimes that helps temporarily, but it does not always reach the deeper structure. Awareness works differently. It does not demand that experience become pleasant before there can be room around it. It does not require that every thought be replaced by a better thought. It reveals that the field in which thoughts appear was never defined by any one thought to begin with. Once that becomes more than an idea, your relationship to time begins to change as well. The trapped mind lives almost entirely in projected time. It is always leaning forward into consequences, outcomes, fears, proofs, and imagined closures. One event happens now, but the mind immediately stretches it across the future. This is one of the main ways enclosure is built. The present is rarely what fully traps a person. It is the future the mind creates out of the present that begins to feel inescapable. That future-building process can become so fast that people think they are responding to reality when they are mostly responding to extension. They are not only feeling today's pain, they are feeling what today's pain seems to guarantee about next month, next year, the rest of life, or the meaning of the self. When that is seen clearly, another kind of freedom becomes available. Not freedom from planning or consequence, but freedom from treating every current difficulty as a prophecy. The future becomes less tyrannical when it is no longer being authored entirely by activated interpretation. This creates a more grounded relationship with the present moment, not a romanticized present in which all difficulty disappears, but a present that is no longer carrying the full imagined burden of the entire future. The body can handle much more truth when truth is not multiplied through projection. The mind can make better decisions when it is not trying to solve 10 years inside one conversation. The self becomes steadier when it is no longer requiring this single moment to explain everything. And this is one of the ways deeper freedom begins becoming livable rather than merely admirable. You may also begin to understand why people who have glimpsed openness can still feel trapped again later. A glimpse is not the same thing as stable embodiment. The old structures may still be practiced, and practiced structures reappear under stress. This is not failure. It is part of learning how the system actually works. Each time the tightening is noticed, even late, something is being rewired. The person is moving from living entirely inside the story to also perceiving the process that creates the story. That process of noticing is how understanding deepens beyond inspiration. Inspiration can open the window, but repeated recognition changes the house. It changes what becomes visible during real life rather than only during reflection. It changes whether the mind's first conclusion has total authority or whether a second seeing can arrive. It changes whether awareness is treated as a concept remembered later or as a living fact quietly present during the event itself. Over time, this alters the ratio between enclosure and openness. And as that ratio changes, the original contradiction becomes less argumentative and more useful. "You are already free" stops sounding like something that denies human struggle. "You still feel trapped" stops sounding like proof that freedom is false. Instead, both statements begin functioning together. One reminds you of the depth that is always here. The other keeps you honest about the lived realities that still shape experience. Together, they create a truer picture than either one could create alone. So the teaching does not ask you to choose between the human and the deeper field that holds the human. It asks you to learn the difference between them well enough that one does not disappear inside the other. Let the body have its limits. Let circumstance have its consequences. Let the mind register difficulty where difficulty is real. But also keep noticing that what you are cannot be reduced to the passing structures that move through it. Once that begins to stabilize, even partially, the feeling of being trapped starts losing its claim to final truth. And when that claim weakens, another possibility enters. You stop waiting for the perfect life in order to discover openness. You stop granting every difficult season the power to define the whole path. You begin living with a quieter confidence that pressure can be real without becoming absolute, that limitation can shape your action without determining your essence, and that awareness is not a reward waiting beyond the next solved problem. It is the unnoticed space in which every problem, every reaction, every story, and every chapter has always been unfolding. And once that becomes more familiar, you start to wonder how many moments in your life only felt like prisons, because no one ever taught you to see the field around the walls.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.